The village was gone. 6 hours of non-stop and relentless rain had destroyed everything in its path. The flood was so deep it could reach over a tall man's head. Houses were sinking into the mud, and the streets were hidden under the dark, swirling current. Everywhere you looked, the world was filled with floating wreckage. Cars bobbed in the waves like toys. Refrigerators, television sets, and old chairs drifted past, bumping into the roofs of houses. Thick layers of garbage, plastic bottles, bags, and scraps of food covered the surface of the flood like a disgusting carpet. Eric, a 20-year-old, sat on the roof. Unable to swim, his life depended entirely on the roof of his own house. He tucked his chin toward his knees, watching the messy world around him. He was only 20, but today, he felt much older. He was surrounded by a disaster that he helped create. As the light hit the murky flood, Eric's eyes were finally opened. For years, Eric lived as if he were blind. When he walked down the street, he would finish a drink and simply drop the bottle on the ground. He never looked back. He saw the piles of trash growing in the corners of his neighborhood, but he acted like they were invisible. He thought he was living in a clean world, simply because he refused to look at the ground. He was a young man who chose to see no evil, thinking that a messy world was someone else's problem to fix. Now, the flood had brought all that hidden garbage back to his doorstep. Right in front of his face, bobbing in the dirty flood, were the very same plastic bags and containers he had thrown away months ago. They were not gone. They had simply been waiting. Eric looked at the floating trash and realized that he couldn't hide anymore. By closing his eyes to the mess on the streets, he had allowed the drains to clog and the flood to rise. He saw now that when we ignore the small bits of trash, we are eventually forced to look at a giant disaster. The only sound left was the heavy groaning of the flood as it pushed against the walls of the sinking houses. Eric remembered the many times people had tried to talk to him. He remembered the mayor telling everyone to clean up and put their trash in the right place. He warned that the rain would one day become a serious problem. Eric had acted like he couldn't hear them. He put on his music, pretending the warnings were just annoying noise. He heard no evil because he didn't want to listen to his own responsibility. Now, sitting in the deep silence of the flood, those ignored voices felt like a heavy weight on his heart. He realized that the people he had ignored were only trying to protect him. The flood was loud now, roaring with the sound of all the warnings he had tuned out. He understood that by closing his ears to the truth, he had missed his chance to help save his home. The roar of the flood was the voice of a lesson he was finally forced to hear. The dirty flood rose a little higher, until it was just touching the bottom of Eric's lips. If he opened his mouth to shout or breathe too deeply, the bitter, foul flood would enter his body. He thought about the many times he could have spoken up. He had seen the big drainage pipes on his street getting filled with silt and garbage. But Eric chose to speak no evil, believing that staying quiet was easier than being the one to report a problem. He didn't want to be the one to tell anyone that the garbage was becoming a danger. Since no one reported the problem and no one talked about it, the disaster just got worse and worse. He wanted to scream for help, but his mouth was sealed by the very flood he had refused to speak about. His failure to use his voice to report the clogged drains had led to the flood reaching his roof. He realized that when we stay silent about the things that are wrong, we eventually lose our voice altogether. As the water teased his lips, Eric slowly closed his eyes. In the darkness of his mind, he remembered the gentle voice of his mother. She used to tell him that God can hear us even if we do not speak, that God can see us even if He is not standing right by our side, and that God knows the words our mouths were too afraid to say. With his heart pounding, Eric began to pray. He didn't use words. He prayed with his soul. He asked for a second chance to be a better man, a cleaner man, and a voice for his village. He promised that if he survived, he would never look away again, close his ears, or shut his mouth to the truth. Suddenly, there was a sign of hope. A rescue boat was coming through the wreckage, heading straight for him. He was being saved. As the rescuers pulled Eric from the roof, he looked at the floating cars and sinking houses one last time. He finally understood that being a human being means taking care of the world we live in, Cleanliness is not just a chore. It is a way to show that we value our lives and our neighbors. We are all responsible for the ground we walk on. If we don't keep our world clean, the mess will eventually rise to claim us. We must keep our eyes open to the mess, our ears open to the truth, and our mouths ready to speak for what is right. Because a clean soul starts with a clean home. You can ignore the garbage, but you cannot ignore the flood. The flood is only as deep as the trash we refuse to pick up.